Good afternoon, all, and welcome to our roundtable discussion on EU migration policy, organized by the Hellenic Foundation for European and Foreign Policy, ELIAMEP, in Athens. Now, the theme of today's discussion is migration, which has become an explosive issue in Europe with local tensions that are fueling the rise of anti-migration political parties, typically on the far right, but not exclusively so. For example, in the recent regional elections in East Germany, the two parties that performed the best are AfD, which is on the right, but also the Bewegung Sarah Wagenknecht, which is on the left. So the same can be seen in the advances of xenophobic movements in other countries, France, the Netherlands, Sweden, but also in Southern Europe, in Spain, Italy, and Greece. All this seems to suggest that European citizens have now turned against migration. I think it is quite characteristic what happened in Germany recently with the decision of the German government last week to introduce temporary controls along its land borders in a bid to, I quote, further restrict irregular immigration and protect German citizens from the acute dangers posed by Islamic terror and serious crime. These were the words of Nancy Faeser, Germany's interior minister. It is quite interesting that all this is happening in a country that only a few years ago welcomed 1 million migrants and asylum seekers. And yet, the economic problem remains. As you may recall, Angela Merkel's famous decision back in 2015 to accept 1 million migrants into Germany was partly driven or inspired by calls on the part of the German Employers Federation to address the needs of German firms for an extra 1 million workers. That's the figure that BDA, the German Employers Federation, actually quoted back then. But of course, labor shortages in the short run and aging populations in the longer run are not confined to Germany. And this, in fact, implies that European prosperity may be unthinkable without a sensible migration policy, coupled, of course, with a serious effort to integrate migrants in the host society. So this is a rather tricky nut to crack, and this is what we are going to talk about in today's roundtable. Our guests are, in alphabetical order, Angeliki Dimitriadi, the head of the migration program here at ELIAMEP, Elias Dinas, professor at European University Institute in Florence, who's joining us shortly, Tommaso Frattini, professor of economics at University of Milan, and Evgenia Vela, who's an assistant professor at the Athens University of Economics and Business. So let me start with my questions to panelists, and I wonder if this is a question for Elias Dinas, but if he's not yet with us, I'll ask Tommaso Frattini to take the floor. And my first question is political, if you like. What do you make of these recent political developments that I mentioned above, that suggest that anti-migration policies are increasingly popular with both the left and the center left, not just the right and the far right, as the case of Germany's Sarah Wagenknecht on the left, but also Denmark's Prime Minister and leader of the Social Democratic Party, Mette Frederiksen. So are we to conclude that hostility to migrants becoming the new normal, hostility to migrants is becoming the new normal? I'll ask Tommaso first, and then whoever wants may also take the floor when Tommaso is done.
Okay, thank you for the invitation. Thank you, Manu. So I note that Elias has connected, so he could also.
Okay, he will go after you.
Yeah, so he's certainly the expert on this issue. So but coming to your question about whether CO2 migrants is becoming the new normal, I think what is certainly true is that what most political forces believe is that hostility to migrants can pay off in terms of support. So I'm not sure whether that is the new normal, but it's certainly something that many parties across the political spectrum are indeed trying to push in their agenda in an effort to counteract the rise in far-right anti-immigration parties who stand on a very clear anti-immigration platform and are successful. Based on that, many parties try to compete for the same share of the electorate, running after the platform of these anti-immigration parties in an attempt to steal part of their electorate, or to gain back, perhaps better, part of their electorate. Having said this, it is probably true, in fact, that even among many traditional voters or supporters of progressive parties and left-wing parties, especially among the working class supporters, there is some dissatisfaction related to immigration. And it is, and again, Elias can certainly tell more and better than me about this, and there is a lot of evidence that, in fact, often immigration triggers electoral responses in favor of anti-immigration parties, right? So Elias has done this famous study on Golden Dawn in Greece, showing that in Greek islands that were more exposed to inflows of refugees, Golden Dawn had a higher support than in islands where that were less exposed. So this is a legitimate concern. It is, I believe, the attempt to actually run after these anti-immigration stances of far-right parties may not always be successful, because often this ends up legitimizing these positions rather than and may end up increasing the support for these parties rather than winning back their supporters. But this seems to be the case in many countries. Presumably, and we probably will come back to that later, what is true is that the inflow, especially large inflows of migrants, and especially those who are more in needs and therefore require more care, more attention, more state intervention, more resources, it can create tensions, does create tension. So the concerns of the host populations about the arrival migrants should not be underestimated, but there may be other responses towards that do not have simply to do with claiming to be tough on migration and closing borders, and maybe instead to think of policies that maximize the benefits that immigration may bring, while minimizing the cost that inevitably it may also have, especially on some sectors of the population.
Thank you, Tommaso. Elias?
Can you hear me? I hope you can hear me well. First of all, I'm very, very happy and pleased to be in the roundtable. I'm sorry I was a couple of minutes late in connecting. I don't have a lot to add to Tommaso's very insightful comments. I guess the way to visualize this is as a vicious circle, or let's put it as, kind of a tragedy of the political commons. You have the presence of these parties, that campaign with essentially, at least in the beginning, one single issue. How these parties come into being and why they come into being, when they come into being at a given country, is a different question that is not necessarily of interest, but for whatever reason they emerge. And then the existing political elites have either of three options to address them. One is to accommodate them, another one is to confront them, and the third one is to ignore them. We have tried all of them. None of them seems to work. If anything works politically or electorally, unfortunately, is accommodation. Like the only example I can think of where we had an effective, a successful, not emergence, but rather electoral confrontation and eventual disappearing, or at least deteriorating in terms of political importance of a radical right, was in Denmark. What happened in Denmark, because of the bloc politics, of the bloc coalition politics, essentially the major parties had no issue in accommodating some of these of this anti-immigration rhetoric, and essentially that worked. I'm not saying that this is, this is in a way a one-to-one evidence of this, but nothing else seems to matter, or nothing else seems to work. If anything, both confrontation and ignoring seem to have exacerbated the support for the radical right. And there is the problem, because the moment then this exacerbation takes place, then you break also the taboo. And there is a lot of evidence showing that the moment these parties becomes electorally successful in a way that makes them part of the institution, it is not so much the case that they themselves continue being very politically salient and relevant, but their ideas become so. So there is, post-war European at least politics was built around some norms. Part of these norms related also given given who were the winners and who were the losers of the Second World War. Part of these norms were based on the idea that we refrain from expressing opinions that can be considered as racist, as essentially bigotry, xenophobic, and so on and so forth. And this taboo is going to be is now being broken precisely as a result of the fact that what we see in front of us, people who were hiding these positions, both elites and public opinion, who were having these positions privately, feel now more freedom to express them publicly. And there are many instances on this, and migration is one part of this. So it is the case that what we see here is not necessarily like the political implications of this electoral success of a set of parties, of a family of parties that concentrates on the issue of migration by espousing anti-immigration attitudes, does not necessarily emerge immediate outcomes, but can have long-term effects precisely because of the diffusion of these ideas in the political system and the normalization and their normalization.
Thank you, Elias. Angeliki, would you like to add your reflections on this?
First of all, for the invitation, it's a pleasure to be here. I don't have a lot to add. What I would like to go back to for a minute is what was mentioned, I think, by Tommaso, one of the last points. I think it's important that we don't underestimate the concern that is expressed by the public. There is a tendency, and it's not altogether wrong, to say, well, there's racism, anti-immigrant feelings, bigotry, etc. That is very well the case in I would say in a lot of the member states. But there are also some concerns that are genuine, and they stem both from the failure of the EU up to this point to create a harmonized, consistent migration and asylum system. And they stem also from the fact that since 2008, different member states have experienced at times one or multiple crises, and these have strained the societal capacity to react. And coupled with a lot of misinformation around what kind of support and what it means in terms of what is offered to migrants and especially refugees, so the ones who need the most assistance, alongside, I think, a mistaken perception and expectation that everything will work out within a very short period of time, that people will integrate very quickly because they're now in a safe environment. So what else is left for them to do but that? So again, that goes back to the fact that policymakers have failed to adequately educate the public about the process and what it means and when do the benefits kick in and what does it actually mean for the society to function as a reception society. I think all these together create a quite volatile mix. And it plays right, of course, into the hand of populist parties and far-right parties, as we're seeing across the EU. And it is also a playbook that is gradually adopted by center-right and center-left parties because, of course, they want to win the votes and the political support. But the concern itself, there are aspects of that concern that it's genuine. And I think this is something that we all need to focus more on trying to address better in the future.
Thank you, Angeliki. Evgenia, would you like to say something? No, not all of you need to answer all questions, but I thought this is a general question that all of you or most of you would like to comment upon.
Do you hear me? Okay. Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to participate in this panel. Actually, let me note it's an interdisciplinary panel with both economists and political scientists. So it's not often that we have the opportunity to have an interdisciplinary discussion on migration. So I find it quite interesting. Regarding the question, I think I've been covered to a great extent by the interventions of the previous speakers. To me, it's quite striking, as I guess it's to you as well, the fact that we have now left-wing parties and right-wing parties sharing views on migration and sharing and proposing similar policies. I think that's quite striking to everyone. And we cannot deny the fact that anti-migration sentiments are once again, gaining momentum across the political spectrum. It's a notable feature that we cannot deny now. Is it becoming the new normal? I'm not sure that we can claim it's becoming the new normal. We need to wait and see, but I think it's worth investigating and being very, very cautious about how the events unfold. That's all from me. Thank you.
Thank you, Evgenia. Now, I would like to invite you to reflect on recent changes in migration policy in the European Union. How do you actually assess the new EU Pact on Migration and Asylum? Is it a step in the right direction, however you may define the right direction? Well, I mean, also taking into account the economy's needs. I'll ask Angeliki first, I think.
It's a $1 million question these days. I think the pact, we need to be a little bit, I think, cautious about the pact for various reasons. First and foremost, it's a political agreement. There was a necessity to reach a consensus before the European Parliament elections. I think it's very clear in the way that the voting took place and the objections that were in place that parties were willing to compromise in order to vote for it. That doesn't necessarily mean that they were thrilled with the context. It is, I think, the most complicated from a legal perspective, but also from a bureaucratic perspective reform that the EU has ever put forth in the last almost 20 years of the CEAS, the Common European Asylum System. So I'm very cautious.
Would you like to summarize very quickly the main novelties, the main points of policy change?
Sure, but let me just for a minute conclude that I'm very cautious about how that implementation will play out, which means I'm very cautious about early assessments. The pact is built around really two axes: the external dimension, which is the foreign policy of migration, essentially, what we do with the third countries from where the migrants come in. And this is where returns take a center stage and role. And this is where I'm also very skeptical, because returns have not worked very well for the last 15 years at the EU level. So I'm not quite sure why policymakers were optimistic that they will do better this time. And the second component is the internal dimension of the pact, which is where it becomes more innovative in its approach in trying to introduce solidarity as complementary component to the existing responsibility that is built into the asylum system in what we used to know as the Dublin, essentially, system, the Dublin regulation, which is maintained. It's just not necessarily called Dublin anymore. So the main priorities are overall to prevent irregular arrivals to the EU, and when these happen, because of course they will continue to happen, to facilitate where possible quick returns and a very quick screening between those who are deemed eligible for protection and those who can in principle be returned either to their country of origin or to a safe third country that has been designated by the EU and the member states. The solidarity is, I think, the most innovative element in there, because for the first time we have this notion of obligatory solidarity, but at the same time, it's not just mandatory, it's also flexible. So it's watered down significantly, and there are various options offered in terms of what shape it can take. It can be physical relocation of refugees, of asylum seekers from a member state to another, which has been a long-standing demand of the southern member states, and especially Greece and Italy. It can take the form of financial contributions, and it can take the form of in-kind contributions, so sending staff, sending experts, which counts a little bit of an indirect way as a financial contribution. And that's innovative in the sense that for the first time, it forces member states to actually do something to assist each other. But at the same time, there has been a lot of criticism in that it doesn't go far enough in achieving the kind of solidarity that the frontline states have always wanted, which has been in the form of relocation. On the other hand, politically, that would not have been viable, and it was very clear, I think, from the beginning. And the other point, and I will stop here, is, which to me is very interesting in the pact and highly problematic, is the crisis and force majeure regulation. Because for the first time within the common European asylum system, we have an entire legal structure that outlines very clearly how member states can derogate from the rules under specific circumstances. And it offers quite significant leeway for derogations, which raises a question of how this is going to be monitored by a commission that is increasingly political, and how is it going to be implemented by countries like Greece or Italy in cases of high influx that don't necessarily have the best history in managing high numbers of arrivals. And I will stop at that.
Thank you. Would any of the others like to say something at this point on this question? The EU Pact. Elias, I can see that you are.
Okay, I asking also, Lily, I have a question which relates to also the country where I currently reside. I think one of the implications of the new pact is this idea of outsourcing to some extent, especially for the border states. And we saw this in the case of the agreement, the bilateral agreement between Italy and Albania. This is new, right? And this is kind of, I'm not sure how well thought it is, in the sense that it is quite unclear, at least to me, what happens, for example, if those migrants who end up in Albania and then they are not being accepted by Italy, you know, whether the EU will have any, you know, responsibility in terms of, you know, how then these people are going to be treated, and the extent of which, you know, you have like adherence to human rights obligations and all that we have all agreed upon in the first place, right? With Dublin and all that. Like, it seems to me that there is this new idea that there can be some sort of outsourcing outside the continent, or outside, not the continent, but outside in a way the union, which can be risky as far as the moral implications of this, or the more, you know, the implications of for these people in terms of international law. But I'm hesitant as to how much this is a new product stemming from the existing pact, or whether this was already coming anyway as a way of these countries, as one of the ways that these countries have invented to address what they perceive as increasing inflows of immigrants over the last years.
Wasn't it Rishi Sunak's, the former British Prime Minister's, idea of using camps in Rwanda as safe places in which asylum applications to be processed? Tommaso, do you have any?
So I mean, this emphasis on externalization of border controls is not new to the pact, right? As you were mentioning. So this is something. I mean, we've seen that starting at the very least from the EU-Turkey deal in 2016, and then you mentioned the recent the recent deal between Italy and Albania for the construction of these Italian centers in Albania, or again a different type of agreement between the UK and Rwanda for processing of asylum applications. So I mean, in different, not to mention the agreements with Libya, with the different Libyan governments, or the recent attempts to strike deals with Tunisia. So I mean, this is something that's been going on for a while, and somehow the pact formalizes that and puts that into a common EU agenda, right? So I think if you want to, so in my point of view, what is positive about the pact, apart from its content, is the fact that for once the EU has tried to give itself a common framework on different aspects of migration policy. I see this as a positive move. On the minus side, what I think is kind of a lost opportunity is that this attempt to create a common framework at the EU level has disproportionately focused on border controls, externalization of processing of applications, externalization of border enforcement procedures, and it does not. And there's very little space for other types of for other dimensions of migration policy, which are extremely important, right? For integration policies, for the creation of legal pathways to enter the EU for economic reasons, for the development of talent partnerships that are partnerships with third countries that are somehow mentioned in the pact. But all these like other migration policy issues have a very low role, play a very small role in the final version of the new Pact on Migration and Asylum, whereas the overwhelming importance of the pact has to do with securitization and border controls, which is, again, I don't want to deny that border controls is an important policy issue, but I think that is that overemphasizing the importance of border controls versus the importance of other aspects of migration policy is makes no. I mean, it's not a good idea for anyone.
Very good. Evgenia, would you like to say anything? I'm going to ask you the next question anyway, which is about the economy. But if you have some thoughts on these, please go ahead.
I only have just a quick comment. I guess one aspect of the new pact that seems to be disappointing, among others, is that little is done to address the root causes of migration, right? So I don't know if Angeliki, who is the expert on this subject, would like to comment more, but we seem to talk all the time about border controls and how to deal with the arrivals of those migrants and refugees. But what about helping those countries, the sending economies, and addressing the root causes? I guess the pact seems to be a little ambitious on this front, right?
If I may, picking up from what Evgenia said, I think we need to, and you're absolutely right, it's extraordinarily ambitious on border controls and very little on anything else, but we have to keep in mind two things. The pact is EU law. EU law can only regulate EU member states. So the EU cannot establish legal procedures that affect third countries without actually speaking with those third countries or reaching an agreement with them, which is why the foreign policy, the external dimension, is complementary but sits outside the pact and in a way pre-exists it. So all these deals that we've had from the EU-Turkey statement and with Tunisia, with Morocco, with Libya, with Egypt, the one that's coming up soon. And the ideas of externalization of asylum processing, all that, they have been in place for quite some time. They work in tandem with the legal framework. And that's why I said in the beginning that the internal dimension is heavily dependent on the external dimension. In other words, we can do whatever it doesn't matter how fast we screen somebody at the border. If they're deemed inadmissible, if they're deemed to be a rejected asylum seeker, they have to be returned. Otherwise, what happens to them? They'll just end up stranded. And returns means you need to reach agreements with third countries to take back their citizens or the people that have crossed the border. And again, this is something that the EU cannot regulate on, but it can try to develop a foreign policy on. And for the root causes specifically, I think the problem is you have increasingly the development aid coming in and being used also as a leverage from the EU side in order to push these countries to sign on to agreements for the return citizens, which sort of works as a counter to the whole purpose of, developing and addressing the root causes. So you have a little bit of, I think, an internal conflict there in the design of that angle of the EU policy.
Thank you, Gilki. All right, let me now ask a question about the economy. So I will ask the economists among us to go first, and then I will excuse the others if you want to skip it, or obviously they can take the floor if they want to make a point. And the question is, can we afford to have fewer migrants? As simple as that. Is a restrictive migration policy, which seems to be very popular, at least among politicians, but also in the electorate at large. In countries like Greece and Italy, we have already mentioned Germany, obviously, and other countries in Europe. But is a restrictive migration policy actually serving the economy's needs? We have labor shortages and we have a future of demographic aging. So what do you think? I'll ask Evgenia first, and then Tommaso, and then the others if they wish.
Manu, I am totally in agreement with your introduction, where you mentioned that these two aspects, on the one hand, labor shortages, meaning that not only we have shortages in terms of workforce, but also we have shortages in terms of skills, coupled with the demographic problem, which is particularly intense both in Europe and in the US, suggests that there is a role that migration can potentially play to help us deal with those challenges in the labor markets. And therefore, adopting restrictive policies for migration is not going to help us deal with those challenges. We know from the literature in economics that migration, both high-skill migration and low-skill migration, contributes to economic growth through different channels. Therefore, we need to achieve a balance in terms of migration flows, taking into account the skills. And certainly, we need to think of the context given the rapid technological change. We are in the era of artificial intelligence, robotization. Labor markets are changing very, very rapidly. We have new skills in demand. And all of these cannot ignore the role that migration can play to help us deal and go forward.
Okay, I should say here that Evgenia Vella wrote a policy brief on EU migration policy that we at ELIAMEP published in June, and which I hope all of you watching us at home will read. Now, Tommaso, what would you say? Can we afford to have fewer migrants? Can Italy afford to have fewer migrants, or Europe?
Yeah, so I think it's, so I don't think migration is like the silver bullet to solve like labor shortages or the demographic imbalances, but certainly it does help addressing both issues, or may help addressing both issues, right? So the shortages issue is slightly more problematic because, like, using migration as a tool, I mean, migration is one of the possible solutions that countries may choose to address labor shortages, the others being training or changing wages, essentially. And using migration as a tool to address labor shortages requires managing somehow migration, right? It requires identifying what shortages there are and letting in the people that may feel these shortages. And this is certainly that is important to do, but not all countries actually put in place or that take into account when designing immigration policy. On the other hand, the demographic issue is the most obvious concern, and it is also the first order issue that most people think about when thinking about the economic benefits of immigration, right? So migrants tend to be young and tend to work, so they are very useful to actually pay our pensions, essentially. So if you, like there's by now many studies that assess the fiscal effects of immigration, and like in the short run, of course, immigration is obviously, in most cases, making a positive fiscal contribution, because, to put it simple, you have people coming in, paying taxes, and not receiving much benefits and allowing to pay pensions. Of course, there's an intertemporal dimensions that plays in. So like migrants come in, then they will stay, they will have children, they will age themselves. But many studies suggest that even in a dynamic perspective, immigration has a positive fiscal effect. But that's why I was saying it's not a silver bullet, meaning that it can be useful like a short-term solution for demographic imbalances, but it's not, unless you think you can keep sustaining demographic imbalances, having always new flows of young migrants. At some point, there must be other solutions that kick in. But certainly, I don't think that, so let me put it this way, perhaps. I don't know whether we can afford whether our economies can afford staying without migration, but certainly they would be worse off if we didn't have enough migrants. But let me also reiterate once more what I said earlier, and that's something that I think it's important to always stress, that the fact that immigration is generally good from an economic point of view does not mean that it is good for everyone. So again, I think that the distributional effects of immigration should not be underplayed. Okay, so it is important to acknowledge them. I think it is important to acknowledge that under most reasonable assumptions and most realistic scenarios, immigration will be good for an economy, but there will be winners and there will be losers. Winners will win more than the losers lose, so overall the country is going to be better off, but it is important that the losers are compensated for their loss, okay? And the winners help compensating the losers from their loss.
Very good point. Thank you. Should I pass to the next question, or would Angeliki or Elias would like to say? Elias, go ahead.
A very quick point, because Tommaso and Eugenia said it basically all. But I want to bring the example of Germany just to show the inherent paradox in the topic and in the discussion, not that we have, but is happening, is taking place in Europe. It is very clear that in Germany the need for migrant labor force is far higher than the level that can be politically sustained. And you see that already in this current reform. Even if this is a political taboo, it's a bomb right now for the country, given also the elections. Everyone has agreed on making it easier to get citizenship, making it easier to bring your families, reducing the income that you need to have in order to be getting citizenship and rights and so the blue card, sorry. And all this is simply an illustration of how much Germany needs migrant labor force and how much this is in a way in contradictions with the public mood. And so you have this kind of reforms that are trying to be very extreme or very restrictive on the controls and all that, but at the same time they try to channel ways through which we can get precisely the labor force that we need. And the problem is that the media and everything, not only the media, essentially the discussion typically, the incentives to make a political fuss out of the former are much higher than out of the latter. And hence you have also this sort of mismatch. Also, let me say that at least in the literature there is kind of a ghost, let's say, discussion as to whether anti-migration attitudes come precisely because of what Tommaso hinted, which is, let's say, competition in the labor market, or whether this is more generally the result of simply different values and norms, and the fact that you have to confront this kind of differentiation. It is unclear. It seems to me that both are happening, and the problem is that, of course, the losers or at least those that have to compete on those both grounds constitute an electorate that has creates more incentives for political campaigning than the rest. I'll stop here.
What you said got me thinking that, at a rather abstract level, it is rather legitimate for electorates to go for a choice that implies a lower level of prosperity in exchange of, I don't know, the pleasures of living with people who are like you, and thinking of the Brexit referendum, I think it is quite clear that the Remain campaign got it wrong, because they thought that it was enough to say that the UK will be poorer as a result of Brexit to win the referendum. We know that they probably convinced people that that was the case, and those who weren't convinced are convinced now that Britain has been made poorer as a result of Brexit, and yet many people, perhaps not all those who voted at the time to leave, believe that it was the right thing to do, come what may, even at the cost of a lower standard of living. But anyway, now one of the things that make migration so toxic a political issue is that the integration of migrants and even more refugees into European societies and European economies is not always very successful. So perhaps meeting the demands of the economy and encouraging a high level of migration, or making a higher level of migration politically sustainable than is the case today, requires the right integration policies. And I wonder, what are the main ingredients of such policies? I used to think perhaps that the Swedish approach is quite successful, not necessarily in terms of integrating migrants and refugees into the economy, but into the society. Probably it seemed to be the right approach. And now we have reached a situation in which there is gang violence next to kindergarten or whatever, which has helped shift a large chunk of the Swedish electorate to anti-migration policy. So my question is, do we know what a right integration policy looks like? Or are we as clueless as everybody else? Can I ask Angeliki first?
I think that, you mentioned the Swedish model. I wouldn't say that it has been, it worked for a very long time. So I think there's something there to take into consideration. Germany's approach worked for a very long time. I think we need to keep in mind two things about integration, and I mentioned one of them earlier in the beginning of this discussion. Integration is a process that takes a long time. It's unrealistic to expect that people are going to arrive into a country and they're going to settle and integrate in it within a short period of time, unless we are talking about the highly skilled. They're usually the group that we differentiate, right? Because they are highly skilled, they come in with a completely different set of benefits and access to the society. So they're in a completely different category on their own. But if we're talking about irregular migrants who could perhaps regularize their stay or remain undocumented, and therefore we're talking about societal integration rather than a broader political, economic integration. And if we're talking about refugees who have received protection, so they're here to stay and integration leads to settlement, then these are long-term processes, and they require both sides to take steps. Integration is not about the migrant integrating into the society. It's also about the society being sufficiently open and flexible to accommodate the arrival of the other and therefore allow for his or her integration. And I think that the example of Sweden, the example of Germany in the past worked because the societies were both flexible and they also had economies that could absorb a significant portion of those who were coming in. And those who were coming in were not as high in numbers as they have been since 2015. Because one thing we need to keep in mind is that since 2015, the majority of asylum seekers at the EU have concentrated in very specific countries for different reasons. But nonetheless, they have tried to go predominantly to Germany, for example, rather than stay in Greece, again, for various reasons. Which of course exercises pressure on the system. So that's one aspect. The second is that integration is heavily linked with the economy. Because in order for someone to integrate and not also be a burden, so to speak, on the system, they need to be able to sustain themselves, which means they need to be able to get a job, which means that the country, the state, whatever system exists, whether it's local, municipal, regional, or federal, needs to be able to provide access to that labor market, potentially subsidize a portion of that entry to the labor market for a period of time, and also facilitate language training. And this is something that, again, that capacity does not exist for different reasons across all of the EU member states, which again pushes the burden of responsibility to very specific countries. And of course, eventually, this is not sustainable in the long run. So for me, it's less of a question of whether we have successful cases of integration and more of whether we can take what has happened in the past with successful integration models and see how we can adapt them to the contemporary realities that we have in Europe.
Has any of you thought that perhaps there is something to be said about the US approach to migration, which is basically, guys, you're on your own, you know, you swim or sink, and that's the end of it. You know, it cost me considerably to say so because for many reasons that I don't want you to bother with now. But, you know, perhaps there's something to be said about a kind of cruel to be kind approach rather than, you know, Swedish style, providing everybody with housing, social benefits, whatever. Language is part of it, right? It's much easier to integrate in the US or in the UK than in a country like Sweden. But anyway, that was a moment of self-doubt that you may want to comment upon or not, as the case may be.
Well, if I may, so I'm not sure that the integration. So I agree with most of what Angeliki has said, of course. But but regarding your point, Manos, I don't think necessarily an integration process. So we should not think of policies that facilitate integration only as policies that directly help out. Okay, so you can. I mean, there are many countries that organize introduction courses that are a mixture of language and vocational skills and the knowledge of the labor market. These are, I think, certainly well meant, and often sometimes they work well, sometimes they don't work well. Depends on how the scheme is designed. It depends on many contextual factors. But apart from these type of explicit policies targeted towards integration, the overall design of the migration policy may help or harm integration. So I give you a few examples. One example is for economic migrants. So if you have so it is very important that migrants have a clear time horizon, certain, so there is certainty about how long they are allowed to stay and how long they can which leads them to know how much they can invest in the home country, right? So like if I know that I go into a country and I will be, and I'm told that I'll be kicked out after 6 months, I don't bother learning the language, I don't bother learning the habits, I don't bother meeting locals. And then even if I end up staying longer, I still haven't learned the language, I haven't made any local friends, and I will be isolated economically and socially, right? So that's, I mean, of course, this is I'm making an extreme example, but this is a bit what has happened in Germany, for instance, in the 70s with guest workers. So guest workers were thought of guests and then ended up staying, right? So, but the fact that they were thought to be temporary meant they didn't make any effort to integrate in the country, because I mean it was a both side effort, of course. So Germany did not try to integrate them, they did not make efforts to integrate because they thought it would go back. Then they ended up staying, but they ended up staying without integrating as they could have if they knew that they could stay longer, right? So in general, so in economic terms, it is important that there is certainty about the possibility of staying, and which allows migrants to maximize their investment in host country specific skills, okay, and or in host country specific human and social capital, if you want, which will help them in their economic integration. And this is, again, this does not require much expenditure on the countryside. It's just letting people stay, okay, not telling them you will be kicked out after 3 months or 6 months. So, or you will we will renew your visa only condition on having a job every other year. So it's if I have longer time horizon, I give them the opportunity to get better. For refugees, some examples of policies that are detrimental to refugee integration are employment bans for asylum seekers, right? So in many countries, asylum seekers, so when people arrive, claim asylum while their application is processed, asylum seekers are in many countries not allowed to work up to a certain number of months, okay? So there are statutory limitations, so after 12 months or 6 months, depending on the country, they're allowed to work. But we know now that this initial ban on employment has long-term detrimental effects on refugee integration. So not only the mechanical effect that they cannot work for 6 months, and so it's delayed, the integration is delayed by 6 months, but those who are prevented from working initially suffer for many more years, even after the ban has expired. So these are examples. And again, having this ban is not costly. I mean, like having the ban is not, or not having the ban is a zero cost policy for the host country from a financial point of view. Another example is allocation of asylum seekers across the country, right? So like if asylum seekers are free to, or refugees are free to decide where to live, they will presumably go and live near where they may have friends or pre-existing networks, or where there's a labor market opportunities. If they're allocated explicitly often, right? There are many countries that have dispersal policies that explicitly prevent them from, so they're designed to avoid the excessive concentration of immigrants or refugees in large cities. But large cities also happen to be the place where there's more labor demand and therefore more job opportunities. So if we displace asylum seekers to remote areas, they will be unable, even if they are in principle entitled to work, they will be unable to actually work and develop their own network, and this will play against their longer term integration. So, and I want to conclude with this. These are examples of aspects of migration policy that do not have an economic cost, but may have very tangible and long-term and persistent effects on migrant integration that the countries should take into account when thinking of how they want to face the phenomenon of immigration.
Very good. Elias?
Manu, if there is time, just for two points, building exactly on both previous speeches. I just want to emphasize a point that was made by Tommaso, especially the idea that when we think about integration, or assimilation policies, we don't necessarily think of policies that help migrants. There are two examples that come to mind, to me at least, almost automatically. One is a historical example, the case of, and actually comes from a study of a connational and very good friend of mine, Vicky Fuka. So the Germans in the First World War in the US were very much, precisely because of the fact that Germany was treated as the reason for which we had the war, were very, very much discriminated against in the US. And the result of this discrimination was not necessarily, let's say, double down on identity, exit options. It was mainly, particularly, increased assimilation effort through naturalization, petitions, and other proxies. Nowadays in Germany, we have also evidence that the Syrian refugees exercise higher assimilation effort in states that were within Germany, where prior attitudes against migrants were more intense. In general, I think this is kind of a more of a type of an optimization problem. You need sticks and carrots, and you need to present them in ways that make the cost of assimilating lower than the perceived benefit. If I see that the probability of me assimilating is extremely low, I'm not gonna, it's because of the sticks, because of various conditions that are put in the way. I will simply double down. I will keep on bonding. I will exercise no effort in merging. On the other hand, if I'm already very well settled and I don't really need, for example, to become Belarusian if I'm Russian, I still won't do anything related to me, I won't still exercise any effort assimilation. So you need a combination of sticks and carrots that make optimal or make it maybe more rational for people to exercise this effort to assimilate. And that is, of course, a very, very difficult. It's easier to say, much more difficult to do. It's a very difficult equation.
That's a good point. Evgenia, would you have anything to say on this?
Just a quick comment. I think it would be interesting not only to study how certain member states have effectively in the past integrated migrants, but also what has happened in other cases where some countries have faced challenges with integration. And I think we can learn from both group of countries. So perhaps I'm thinking about France, where integration of migrants remains an issue. And I would say that it's obviously the labor market integration that comes first to our mind. I think paying attention also to how cultural differences can be reconciled between migrants and local populations is of paramount importance.
Thank you. Now, one of you, I think it was Angeliki, mentioned high-skilled migrants. So my next question is about precisely that. So we have some governments, including in the southern periphery of the EU, certainly Greece, certainly Italy, which have tried to attract high-skilled migrants through tax breaks and other sweeteners. Some of us have benefited directly from that. So I wonder, I've always thought that such policies are difficult to justify from an equity perspective. It seems to me it's a waste of taxpayers' money to workers who are already rather well off. But apart from that, and I may be wrong here, do you think that such policies do what they are supposed to do? Are they effective in attracting long-term stay in the country? So the Greek government has introduced tax breaks for, I don't know, digital nomads or whatever. Is the cost-benefit ratio of such policies attractive enough? What do you think? Tommaso.
Yes, so this is a very contentious issue, right? There's many countries that have these type of policies, and I basically share your concerns about. So that, I mean, clearly it is a regressive form of taxation, because you are like decreasing taxes for the rich, basically. Whether it is a fact, on the other hand, it is of course. So I mean, the idea behind this policy is that it is good to attract high-skilled individuals from abroad and bring them in the country. So first of all, I think it's extremely hard to measure the size of the positive externalities that having high-skilled individuals in a country may have, or like the effect of agglomeration economies, and that certainly exists. So I mean, there is a benefit, but it is what I'm trying to say is that measuring that in a credible way is incredibly difficult because it requires a lot of assumptions.
Well, I mean, in the case of celebrated footballers, I cannot really see the agglomeration effects and externalities here.
Right.
But anyway, I may be biased.
No, but it's if you look out of football, right? So the question is whether their effects. So I think if they are generous enough, the policies are effective in attracting at least short-term individuals. The question is whether they're cost-effective, because they may be very expensive, and they also benefit all the infra-marginal movers, so people who would have moved anyways and do not move because of the policy. So the aim of the policy is to attract people who would otherwise have stayed somewhere else and moved to that country. So so overall, I think this is not a particularly. I mean, if every country in the world had the same policy, then of course this wouldn't work out. So it's a race to the bottom, and there's no increase in welfare. So first of all, it works only if a few countries do it and others don't. It is a bit of a shortcut to make countries attractive to high-skilled migrants or to high-skilled individuals, because often the main beneficiaries of these policies are natives of the country that were living abroad and that are encouraged to go back. So that's clearly, like in Italy, the largest share of beneficiaries are Italians who work abroad and come back to Italy. And at least in academia, you see that has been effective. So I don't know, again, how many of those who have come back would have come back anyways, but some have. So certainly it is now there are very generous tax exemptions that make it extremely attractive to actually come and work in Italy, especially if you are from Italy and you've been working abroad. But this is somehow a shortcut, I was saying, for rather than addressing the root causes of why people actually leave, high-skilled individuals leave a country, you just attract them on an ad hoc policy that doesn't fix the underlying problem. However, having said again all of these, there is a recent study by two Italian economists who have tried to assess the effectiveness of this policy. So let me name them because they deserve it. So Jacopo Bassetto and Giuseppe Pedico, and they have this paper where they study the effectiveness of the policy. And what do they find? Well, they find that it has been probably effective. It probably also pays off, but what are the characteristics of such schemes that make them more effective? First of all, they should be targeted. So basically, the people that you want to attract are people who will spend the rest of their life in the country. Okay, so you want to attract back people or attract people for the first time in your country, and then have them stay after they have finished once their tax exemption period basically expires, and they start paying taxes overall, right? So these might be, so for them to be more effective, they should be ideally be targeted to younger individuals who have longer time horizons in front of them. They shouldn't last too long, because otherwise they become very costly to sustain. And there should be ideally some phasing out of the policy rather than an abrupt discontinue and the abrupt end of the policy, because that might actually trigger the decision to leave again. So if after not paying taxes for 10 years, all of a sudden you're back to paying a substantial share of your income in income taxes, then that may trigger your decision to leave. Whereas if it is phased out over some longer time horizon, it may be more effective. Another feature of the current Italian scheme that I think is particularly wise, is that it gives incentives to, so basically the duration of the scheme is extended if you make actions that increase your probability of staying in the country. So for those who have kids or those who buy property in Italy, the tax exemption period is increased, right? So if you make steps that make you more unlikely to leave, then we reward that. So I don't know. So if you ask me whether I'm in favor or against these policies, I don't know. I don't have a clear stance. I think that there are pros and cons, and but if you want to design them properly, these are features that should be taken into account. And then I shut up and leave the others speak. I think what we really still missed so a proper evaluation of these policies rests ultimately on the evaluation of how big the externalities, how big the societal or economic benefits of having high-skilled individuals around. And because these are so hard to measure, it is hard to properly evaluate the policy properly evaluate the effectiveness of the policy.
Very good. Evgenia?
So actually, I think these policies could somehow affect incentives and play a role in shaping incentives. I'm not sure they are the determinant factor for high-skilled professionals to come back to Italy or to come back to Greece. And as far as I know, there are also important differences in the policies that the two countries have implemented. For example, in Greece, I think they tried also to target the private sector. So someone who is coming back to work in Greek universities is not entitled to those tax benefits, for example, because universities are public. So perhaps that's another way that the policymakers try to affect incentives. However, in the longer run, and considering that high-skilled professionals somehow remain mobile, right? There are more important reforms that matter, in my opinion, to keep those professionals in this country or in Italy, and to make them contribute significantly. So we need to think about other type of reforms: healthcare, education, and institutions, and all of those keywords that we often mention when we talk about the countries of Southern Europe.
Good point. Ilias, probably a beneficiary of Italy's generous policies.
In a European-wide context, I guess. No, I don't have much to add on to these points. I guess, as Tommaso also kind of, asserted, like these policies essentially hinge on how much the externalities in human capital and spillovers that they generate can outweigh the regressive character. I think there is also a study on how the Jewish immigrants that ended up academics going to specific departments of economics, I think, in the US, how much they then had long-term, extremely positive, like very, very important positive effects. I think there's another category that is even more problematic than this human capital-oriented category, which is what we see oftentimes in Cyprus, or some cases also in some countries, which is essentially, using specific cities or generally legislation to attract essentially just capital, not human capital. You can, buy a house that is expensive enough to gain you a European passport, for example. And then I guess the character of this is even more dubious than it is when it comes to the type of the type of applications that Tommaso alluded to. And I think, again, I'm sure this, this is clearly an empirical question. We need to know, like, study will tell us if measured properly what the effect would be in the short run, in the mid run, and in the long run. But it seems to me, at least from the outset, intuitively, that these kind of policies are pretty problematic.
Well, the golden visa is another
golden
example.
Visa, yes, that's what I had in mind. Yes.
It's not exactly a policy to attract high-skilled migrants. It's a policy.
No, it's a policy to capital. Yeah, but yeah, they come
to sell European Union citizenship to third country citizens. All right, Agelgi, would you like to? You'll skip. All right. I don't think you will skip the next question because it is controversial and it is about Greece, but perhaps. Not just Greece. We had similar issues in Italy. And what I mean is that, there has been a series of incidents around migration into Greece that have attracted the interest of international media and humanitarian organizations and so on. And the charts here is that covert pushback operations have directly or indirectly caused the deaths of hundreds of persons crossing the Mediterranean on makeshift boats. Of course, others, the government or others claim that this is not true. There is no evidence of that. But the point I'm trying to make is that the unspoken assumption of those who support or at least tolerate such policies, I find them sensible on the whole, is that while possibly of dubious morality, the harsh treatment of asylum seekers or refugees is effective in deterring more crossings and more landings. So my question is, do you see any merit in that assertion? Do we know that this kind of, say, call it immoral or a certainly harsh response to migration, do we know that it works, that it causes fewer people to cross or fewer people to land in the country?
Should have taken the highly skilled question. Yeah.
I think it was easy.
Yeah. Okay. So let me start with the use of the word morality, because it's something that I've heard before. And I think we need to be very clear that this is not a question of morals, and this is not so much a question of values. This is a question of the law and how we apply the law and whether we stick to the law, and therefore whether we uphold the rule of law, which is actually the foundational basis of the EU. So there is the legal aspect. Pushbacks are illegal. There is no way around them. There is no way to justify them legally. They constitute a violation of international, European, and national laws. And that's something that we need to take as a given. Now, whether border violence works, any form of really border violence, is a little bit of a tricky question, because there is no straightforward answer. What I would say to you is that, for example, we know that fencing, erecting fences, and any kind of physical obstacle at the border in that specific spot, of course, will reduce the numbers, because there's a physical obstacle and one is not able necessarily to go beyond it. That doesn't mean, however, that irregular migration will not occur, because they will figure out other routes. They will figure out ways of circumventing said obstacle. It's a little bit the same around the maritime border. Undertaking interdiction practices, interceptions, pushbacks, whatever one wants to call them, may, at that specific spot, at that specific time, prevent an X number of arrivals, sure. But that doesn't mean that the next day or the next couple of hours or the next week or the next month, people will not find alternative routes of entry. People will not be able to somehow cross. So if we're thinking in terms of effectiveness, I would say it's probably a fairly costly practice financially. And we had done research on this at ELIAMEP back in 2015. And at the same time, it's not necessarily the most effective form in terms of reducing irregular migration, aside from the legality of it, and the questions of on morals and values.
Ilias, any thoughts?
I fully agree with Angeliki. I guess I would contest the word dubious in your question. It is clearly morally problematic. In a way, you know, it asks us, first of all, it's very difficult to distinguish the empirical component, the effectiveness, from the normative component. Yeah, there are studies, for example, there is a study that went to Gambia and found the European, African youngsters who showed high potential of and willingness, intention to migrate to Europe, and then when they were sort of randomly assigning to them information about the risks of the journey, the potential, the likelihood of pushbacks, indeed they showed lasting reduction in such willingness. And generally, there is work showing that pull factors and pushbacks are a negative pull factor do reduce immigration. However, this is almost equivalent to saying, let's kill some prisoners to reduce crime. This is the morality of this practice, and that makes me extremely hesitant in you know, taking any policy advice from studies that show that pull factors, especially pushbacks in that respect, might have any effect on reducing, let's say, inflows. That's all I can say on this.
Tommaso?
Yeah, so I think Angeliki and Elias has said pretty much what I would have also said. So I think the key point here is to keep in mind that, so actually, let me start from your, I would also question your wording. I don't think it's an unspoken assumption that although this the policy might be dubious morality, it will deter migration. I think this is exactly the explicit target of the policies, or any like a border enforcement policy, is to deter further migration, right? So if you actually, if you think, and if you take it to the extreme, it may be effective, right? So if I know that with probability 1, I die if I try to cross, I will not cross. So that's a fact. So I mean, that's like in theory that's clearly obvious. Okay. So the point is, however, that people, I mean, many regular migrants are fully aware of the risks that they're facing. So they're taking incredibly high risks. They're paying incredibly high cost, financial and non-financial cost of migration. So increasing the cost of migration even more is unlikely to discourage very large shares of potential migrants from migrating, right? So I think, like, I remember results from the type of studies that Elias was mentioning. So I remember that some of the studies were actually finding that many people in African countries were overestimating the risk of death. So like if you reveal them what's the actual probability of dying, they would think, wow, so it's less than what I thought. So, I mean, people are somehow aware of the risk that they're taking, many people, and of course, and increasing the risk, increasing the cost is not going to be incredibly effective. Okay, leaving any other consideration aside, and this is also because what Angeliki said is very true, and that's been shown again in many studies in many countries. So either you're able to fully seal the borders everywhere completely, or people will be diverted to other routes. So in this sense, again, if you want, this is the European context a bit tricky, because it may, so if you increase border enforcement on a specific trait of the European borders, what will happen is that migrants will take different routes, which may be in the interest of the country that is increasing enforcement on its own border, but will not decrease possibly the overall number of migrants coming to Europe, will just enter through a different country, right? So this is an important coordination problem at the EU level, which will lead possibly to the other countries increasing border enforcement effort too, and then again leading to a race to an overall increase of border enforcement efforts that cannot be ever perfect. So the bottom line is, I think there is an enormous moral or issue involved in some types of border enforcement policies. Okay, some are outright illegal, others are questionable and never, even if they're legal. Having said this, and abstracting from this, I think they're largely ineffective and they're very cost ineffective. Okay, so again, I think always the question should be, if our aim is to reduce the cost, the potential cost that migration brings to our countries, our European countries, is it better to spend €1 extra on border enforcement, or is it better to spend €1 extra on integration policies of some type? Okay, so what's gonna be more effective in minimizing the cost that immigration may have, and possibly maximizing benefits that immigration also has? And I think if you look at it that way, I think it's very likely that spending €1 more on integration policy is going to be way more effective than spending €1 more on increasing border enforcement, which is already very high. And it is also, it has also been a voice of expenditure that's been increasing a lot at the European level over time. So if you look at the Frontex budget, it has increased dramatically over the last years, and the border enforcement operations are those that take the largest share of our Frontex budget.
Very good. Evgenia?
I'm fully covered here. Thank you. I think the example that Elias made with prison and killing prisoners to reduce crime speaks for itself.
Well, it's the El Salvadorian approach to crime that some people might argue that it actually works.
All right.
You don't take the bait of my provocative questions. Fair enough.
Can I do so in a way? Like, it's not a matter of European identity. Like, we agreed, going back to Agility's point, we agreed at some point that we are going to share some moral standards. And this discussion is essentially, closing the eye to those who want to deviate from those standards and making them gradually enter through, channels that are not obviously the main ones, but gradually can also become more legitimized. That is, it's a problem beyond the action itself. The whole discussion about this takes us away from the moral standards on which we all, decided to build this, and keeping this is a public good provision to which I think we should all try to, offer our share.
That's a good point. Tommaso, you wanted to say something, perhaps? Right. Okay, we have reached nearly the end. I only have one more question. I hope quick question, or one that allows a brief answer. Ursula von der Leyen is trying to put together the next European Commission. So I was wondering, if you were to write a memo to the next commissioner with the migration brief, what would you suggest? Politicians are very busy. They are only going to read a memo of, 50 words, no more. So what would you advise the next European Commission and the commissioner with a migration brief to actually do in order to meet the continent's needs, taking into account conflicting interests in Europe? Agiliki, I'm sure you have lots to say on the topic.
Okay. No, actually, I don't. It's very specific. Legal pathways, and legal pathways both for low-skilled and migrants, but also for refugees potentially linked with the labor market. So moving away from the strict reception and refugee protection perspective and incorporating access to the labor market. I would urge a better mapping of what skills are available, what skills will be needed in the future, especially for countries in the south like Greece, which has proven not very capable of doing that, and how can the existing migrant communities be trained or utilized as regards these labor market needs, and to start really building viable partnerships with third countries that are based not only on EU interests, but also in genuinely advancing the needs of those countries. Because to me, it feels that this is going to be the only way forward in the foreign policy of migration if we want to have any chance of this working in the future. Yeah, those would be my 3 cents.
Good enough for me. Tommaso?
Well, I really think I don't have much to add what Angeliki said. So I think these are the key points: is building legal pathways of migration to Europe. I think this is the number one policy priority, in my opinion. As I said in my initial, so the first time I spoke, I think that we should. So the focus has so far been overwhelmingly border controls, and I think it is important to shift the focus on increasing legal pathways of migration and facilitating the integration of those who are here and those who will come in the future, because they will come, that we like it or not. And thus thinking of how, again, we can reap the benefits for everyone from the presence of immigration should be the political priority number one.
Thank you, Tommaso. Elias?
Yeah, I guess I will repeat what the previous speaker said in different words. I think there was a study that was trying in a way to pretty much get into your question, which was like, let's try to see what is the optimal strategy, what has proved in large terms more effective. And they came up with this evidence that if anything works, that is the so-called, I think, the nut or the chestnut type of policy, which you are very strong on the outside and soft in the inside. And I think, as Tommaso said, we have been very much focusing on the outside, on the strong part. And I think we need to move ahead with the inner part. And I think fundamental here, as Angeliki also pointed out, I think it was the first point that she made in her last intervention, facilitate working rights. Like, this is, you know, the main major reason for migration in the first place, and the main consideration, and the path then for integration within the society. So these reforms that would enable people and generate more opportunities for being accommodated in the labor market would be extremely would be what I think should be prioritized.
Thank you, Elias. Evgenia?
As a last point, as an additional point, I would say also a stronger effort to educate and inform the society about the potential benefits of migration. I think if we go and randomly ask people what do they think, there is this general perception that, you know, migrants come and they take the jobs, they drive wages down. But most people are not aware of what the literature says, the studies that have been conducted, and I think it's worth making this effort to communicate those findings.
All right, let's bring this roundtable discussion to an end. We haven't quite solved all the issues that we addressed, but I hope you share my feeling that we have had a very thoughtful discussion of all those difficult and, you know, contested issues. I for sure have learned a lot and you know, took lots of notes, and I'm sure those in the audience also learned a lot. So Let me thank you, our panelists, Angeliki Dimitriadi, Elias Dinas, Tommaso Frattini, and Evgenia Vella. And let me thank all of you for being with us today. Have a great evening.
Thank you very much.